Hi everybody, welcome back to our class for English 247. This is for our class for June 14th, Tuesday, where I wanted to talk about writing papers because we are going to be having a paper soon, and I also wanted to talk about persuasion. And in terms of journals, know that we are a little bit behind schedule. So I am giving you an extension on your journal for persuasion, though certainly you can hand it in early, but I thought up until the 16th, which is Thursday at 11:59 p.m. That'll give us an opportunity to put some closure onto persuasion. And we started talking a little bit about it last class, and I had suggested that you try to keep a running review of the characters because they are easy to interchange with one another, especially because they oftentimes have similar names because we're working with family members. And one of the things that this text is going to show us is the life of the very privileged in the 1800s, which will be in direct contrast to something like Jane Eyre's life, which is going to be the next major text that we will be reading over the course of the semester. And certainly when we get to incidents in the life of the slave girl, we'll see that the lives of individuals like Victor Frankenstein and even Jane Eyre on some level are quite comfortable compared to the realities of the brutality associated with slavery. Now, in terms of our first paper, I'm also going to give an extension. It will now be due on the 23rd, which is a Thursday, at 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu, similar to what you've been doing with your journals. So at this point in the semester, you should have submitted in journal number 1 on Frankenstein, and I would have reviewed that, not for grammar or mechanics, but just for content, and I would have returned it back to you so that if you haven't received it, please let me know. And I indicated that I wanted to approach it as if we were having a conversation on paper. So again, I'm not evaluating it in a formal way, the way I would an academic paper, but on a checkmark system. So a plus is excellent. A check plus is very good, which is where the majority of the grades are. A plus is satisfactory. You want to be in one of those 3 levels. There's also a check minus, which is less than satisfactory, and a minus, which is unsatisfactory. And I'm asking you to do the same thing for persuasion that you did with Frankenstein, but obviously with a different text. Also note that I'm aware that my handwriting isn't always easy to decipher, so if you're having difficulties with reading some of my comments, please let me know and I can walk you through those. But in terms of our first paper, what I wanted to do was to talk about, or to have you talk about, our first set of readings, whether it be the story of an hour, but understand that writing about a short story can be very different than writing about a novel, so you probably want to do a much more in-depth analysis. Frankenstein or persuasion. Jane Eyre is also a possibility, but the reality is that we really wouldn't have had time to talk about Jane Eyre for the first paper. So I'm assuming that Jane Eyre would be an option for your second paper, because your second paper is going to be very similar to what your first paper was, a critical paper, a 4 to 5 page analysis of some sort of element within the text. And everybody has the option of rewriting the first paper. I think of the first paper as a kind of trial, if you will, and that I will definitely review it in a formal manner for grammar and mechanics as well as for content, and put a letter grade on it with some commentary, and then return that back to you. And if you're content with your grade, you're done. But if it turns out that you would like to earn a higher grade, you could take my comments into account. And if you need further direction, please let me know. And I'll be happy to meet with you and we can talk about the details of your specific paper. And you can do a revision of your paper incorporating my feedback, and you get the higher of the 2 grades, which I don't think is giving you any kind of advantage, because ultimately this is the way professional writers write, is that they acquire feedback and they incorporate that feedback. In fact, we even talked about that with Frankenstein, that there was even some discussion as to whether or not Mary Shelley could be given full credit for her text, because Percy Shelley was her editor. And I had suggested that I'm not sure if that would have happened if Percy Shelley was the author, and Mary Shelley was the one who was giving editorial commentary. But nevertheless, the idea behind the revision is that you can incorporate my feedback and learn from that so that you can ultimately apply that to the second paper, which is due at the very ending of the semester. So, in other words, you wouldn't have time to revise it. But the idea is that everybody has the option of revising the first paper, and you have up until the ending of the semester to hand in your revision. I just ask that you hand in the original with my comments along with your revision, and again, you get the higher of the 2 grades. And that said, it is perhaps possible to do a revision for the second paper, but you would have to hand it in early enough so that there would be time for you to submit it, for me to evaluate, and for you to revise it. So it's not necessarily guaranteed the way a revision is for the first paper. Now, in terms of the papers, one of my hopes is that you'll be able to incorporate some of your journal commentary into your paper. That said, you don't necessarily have to, but one of the ideas behind the journals is that it can help you think about particular ideas. And occasionally when I'm reading your journals, if I see something that might be appropriate for a paper, or if you write in your discussion form response something that might be appropriate for a paper, I would let you know. But basically, you've got a lot of latitude with the paper. As you know, I put suggested paper topics in the syllabus and other documents folder for you to consider, where you could talk about something like character and the importance of a particular character in the text, or comparing and contrasting 2 different characters, either in one text or perhaps in 2 texts. Or you can talk about something like gender, because obviously this is a women in literature class, so we've been talking a great deal about gender. But that said, each of the texts also have their own unique themes and ideas. So for instance, something like the epistolary novel technique could be something that you might want to examine in greater depth for a novel like Frankenstein. Obviously, that wouldn't be applicable for something like Persuasion because it's not written in that particular format. And in terms of writing papers, my assumption is that you've already gone through some of the criteria of how to write a paper in your previous English classes, but I also wanted to review this somewhat briefly on my own. So again, in the syllabus and other documents folder, you'll see that I have uploaded a document entitled The Critical Paper, which basically reviews how to write a paper. And I can tell you that this document was submitted to me when I was an undergraduate student many eons ago, and I've saved it. And it's still, in my opinion, one of the best reviews of how to write a paper. But of course, there are other resources available. And you can see in the notes below, I've indicated a web link that you might be interested in if you're not already familiar with it. Purdue OWL. And this is a website that is put out by Purdue University, but it's accessible to the public so that you don't have to be a student of Purdue. And it talks about the entire writing process from the very beginnings, brainstorming ideas, to the very ending, which is proofreading and submitting. So you can easily, if you so wanted to, review some of the elements of how to write a paper in Purdue OWL. There is also the GCC Library website, because the library is well aware that one of your major assignments will probably be, if not multiple major assignments, will be writing papers. So they too have a link right on the homepage of the library website on how to write papers. We are using the MLA, or the Modern Language Association system, for documentation. But you can see that there are many systems for documenting or citing your sources. For instance, there is the APA, the American Psychological Association, which is usually standard for the sciences. But the MLA, the Modern Language Association, this is what we use for languages, much like English classes, and also the humanities. And I'm also going to be briefly reviewing that with you as well. Also in our syllabus and other documents folder, there's a grading criteria about how or some of the expectations for an A paper, some of the expectations for a B paper, some of the expectations for a C paper, and so forth, that could be of use to you. So this is included with our syllabus and our course outline. But in terms of the handout that I was referencing, the critical paper, it's divided up into 3 sections: the planning section, the writing section, and the proofreading section. And I can tell you that most students skip planning, go straight to writing, and then they run out of time and there isn't time to do proofreading. So I encourage you to begin now with the planning section rather than trying to write the entire paper at the last minute, to do it in steps and stages. You'll end up with a much better paper, especially if you can begin with generating ideas and not worry about language or mechanics. And then later on, you can worry about the actual polishing of the sentences. And keep in mind that your job is to analyze, in other words, to interpret, not to summarize, not to do what I call the junior high school book report. So you can assume that the reader has some familiarity with the text and you're merely interpreting. So you don't need to retell the story. Another way to say this is confine your comments on plot to the subordinate clauses and emphasize in the main clause the significance of that action. Or in other words, the bulk of your paper and your sentences should be about interpretation. And what you need to do is to begin with a strong thesis, and that happens to be an interpretive conclusion about the work. The thesis is your position. Basically, it's a 1 or 2 sentence summary of what your paper is about, which can be somewhat complex because you may not necessarily know what your paper is about until you're done writing it. No one said that you had to write your paper in chronological order. So you could actually, and many students do this, and I myself have oftentimes done this with writing a paper, create the body of the paper, reread the body, and summarize what was written in the body in 1 or 2 sentences. Put that in the introductory paragraph, and that is your thesis or your position. And you want to make sure that your thesis is something that's specific. And there are 2 examples in the critical paper handout about a thesis that would not be appropriate. The first being saying, in Hamlet, Shakespeare explores the complexities of experience. Now, obviously, this was a handout for a Shakespeare class, but I think it particularly works well for the point that I'm making, that every text and every author explores the complexities of experience. So in other words, your sentence is meaningless. We could say this about every text we're reading in this particular class as well. So in Frankenstein, Mary Shelley explores the complexities of experience. In other words, it's empty phrasing. It's not saying much of anything. Or saying Shakespeare employs much imagery in Hamlet. My response as a reader would probably be, yeah, so what? Isn't that something that most authors do? Kate Chopin also employs much imagery in her text, The Story of an Hour. What's more important for your thesis is what imagery is employed and why, not the fact that imagery is used. So, in your introduction or your opening paragraph, you want to list the name of the text that you are examining. You want to list the name of the author. You want to list your thesis. And you want to remember the criteria for writing a paragraph. That a paragraph is about one unique idea, and it is minimum 3 sentences long because it needs a beginning, a middle, and an end. But it's probably much longer than that. And the first sentence of the paragraph, known as the topic sentence, often summarizes what the main point of that paragraph is. So if your paper is well written, you should be able to read the first sentences of all of your paragraphs and get a kind of skeletal outline. This works as well when you're reading a textbook too. Not to say that all textbooks are well written, as I'm sure you're quite aware. So the introductory paragraph is oftentimes difficult to write because you may not necessarily know what your thesis is. The concluding paragraph can be difficult to write because you've said everything and you've run out of energy and time. And keep in mind that you want your introduction and your conclusion to be just as developed as any of your other paragraphs. Minimum 3 sentences, hopefully much longer. So for the conclusion, perhaps you can save some impressive observation for the end. Or one technique that usually works is relating the text that you are examining to contemporary times. And then, of course, you've got the body. And the body of your paper is devoted to providing evidence to convince the reader of the validity of your thesis or the position that you've taken. You can almost think of yourself as a courtroom attorney, and what you are doing is you are gathering the evidence to present to the court. And a good courtroom attorney can argue either side of the case. Obviously, some cases have stronger evidence on one side or another, but a good attorney is able to pick and choose those pieces of evidence that will make that particular position the strongest possible for the judge and the jury. So, in other words, in terms of literature, it's quite possible that multiple students can have differing interpretations. In fact, they can even be in direct contradiction with one another, and all of them be equally valid if enough evidence is used from the text in order to be able to support that particular position. And the evidence that you're using from the text is a combination of paraphrasing, putting things in your own words. Again, you don't have to retell the entire story, only those pieces that are relevant for your particular argument. And quotation, which means you're using somebody else's language word for word. And there are ways to go about documenting that, as I had indicated, the MLA, or Modern Language Association, that I'll talk about shortly. Keep in mind that my job is to basically be skeptical. So whatever position you take, I'm going to take the opposite position. If you say that Victor Frankenstein is filled with hubris or arrogance, I'm going to say no, he's not, even though I've admitted that he is. So you need to provide evidence from the text, again through paraphrase and quotation, in order to be able to support that. So that said, I oftentimes am asked, well, how much should I use? And this isn't an exact science. Whenever you have a major point, certainly you want to have a piece of evidence to support it. But I can't give you a magic formula and tell you a specific number of quotes, for instance, that you can use. But keep in mind that if something is particularly well said or something can be used as evidence to support your position, that's probably a good place to put a quote. And I've seen the two extremes in papers, the paper that has no quotation whatsoever, and you do need quotation for evidence, or the other, the paper that's filled with quotation because the author doesn't really have much to say, so they're just padding the paper with quotation in order to get length. And while I've suggested your paper should be approximately 4 to 5 pages long, really it should be as long as it needs to be. This is just my best guesstimate as to how much space and time you would probably need to construct a paper. But in the end, you want to, based on the thesis that you've chosen, use enough evidence to support that particular thesis. That will be your evidence. So, the second piece of the handout about the critical paper talks about writing. That the first principle of good writing is simplicity, and the second is economy. And to keep that in mind with your own writing. So I suggested, I think it's best to write in stages and not to worry necessarily about the stylistic constructions of the sentences until you have your argument. Then you can go back to your paper and then you can polish those sentences. The idea is to say as much as possible in the fewest words as possible. And I know this can be somewhat discouraging to an author because if you're doing that, you're going to be losing length. But better to have less length and more clarity than to have a paper that is redundant, or to have a paper that is wordy, or to have a paper that merely is confusing. So what you should be able to do is save enough time at the ending of a writing assignment so that you could look at each sentence independently and ask yourself, can I rephrase this sentence in fewer words without sacrificing meaning? And if the answer is yes, 9 out of 10 times, that's exactly what you want to do, because again, you want to try to be concise and you want to try to be precise. So some ways to do this: use strong verbs and nouns, adjectives and adverbs, descriptive words. There's nothing wrong with them, but again, you don't want to overuse them so you're padding your paper. Prefer the active to the passive voice. So when we talk about a sentence being active, it's very clear that the subject of the sentence, or who or what is performing the action in the sentence, is clearly engaged in the performance of that action. So an active sentence would be something like Lillian graded the papers, because the subject of the sentence is Lillian, because Lillian did the grading. And it's very clear that the subject of the sentence is engaged in the action of grading when I say that Lillian graded the papers. A passive construction of that same sentence would be, the papers were graded by Lillian. Now I'm saying the same thing, but it's as if the action were occurring. The grading was occurring to the subject rather than the subject performing the action. But if that seems a bit confusing, think about the rule about being concise. That both of these sentences state the same thing, but one sentence is shorter than another. Lillian graded the papers as 4 words. The papers were graded by Lillian as 6 words. And again, the rule of thumb, if you can state something in fewer words without sacrificing meaning, do so. Again, be less worried about length and be more worried about the quality and the construction of your sentences. Vary your sentences. You should have a mix of some short ones and some long ones. Too many short ones, it sounds very simplistic. Too many long ones, it can sound very complex. And also, you want to vary your sentence beginnings, especially for sentences that appear next to one another. You don't want 3 sentences in a row, for instance, beginning with the word persuasion. You want to change things up a little bit. Again, I had indicated a paragraph is a developed idea, so avoid the temptation to write 1 or 2 sentences. Avoid cliches, which are overused expressions that no longer have any kind of independent meaning. And many of those cliches, actually, if you ever take a Shakespeare class, you will find out were originally created by Shakespeare, though not necessarily all of them. But at the time they were original, but now they're not. So if you've ever heard of something like dead as a doornail or jealousy is that green-eyed monster, again, that's considered a cliche, an overused expression. It would be much better for you to put it in your own language because it's considered lazy to be using that kind of crutch. Think about some of the expressions we use too in language. It's raining cats and dogs. Imagine being a second language user and wondering what cats and dogs have to do with rain and why cats go before dogs and not dogs before cats in that expression. Rather, it's much better to say that it's raining heavily in this instance. And it's the same idea behind slang, which is informal language that's usually used to exclude a group of individuals. Think about what adolescents do every generation. They create their own language to exclude adults from understanding what they're saying. Now, sometimes slang does go mainstream so that most groups use that language, but it's still considered to be informal and non-standard. So when I say this is a cool person, I suspect most of you understand that I'm saying this person is interesting or engaging. But technically, cool is related to temperature. Again, imagine a second language or a third language speaker trying to understand the connection, especially when they learn that when you say someone is hot, they're physically attractive. So better to say that this person is interesting or engaging rather than cool. And I always use an example from the news. I try to use humorous examples, but this is not a humorous example, so you've been warned. And it happened a few decades ago, and it happened to a second language student, actually, who was going to a party. And he ended up going to the wrong home. And this was in all over the newspapers. He ended up going to a home that had been recently burglarized. So the owner of the home was rather, shall we say, jittery. And the owner of the home opened the door, and the owner of the home said, "Freeze," to the student. And the student either misheard or misunderstood, or maybe didn't hear at all, and took a step forward. Now, freeze is a slang term for stop. Whether the student knew this and disobeyed or just misunderstood, we can never know for certain. But the fact is he did the exact opposite of freezing. He moved forward. And the owner took out the gun that he always wore and shot that student dead on the doorstep because of a miscommunication in language. And it changed, honestly, how language was taught in classrooms across America. That, yes, formal language, the language of business, the language of education, the language of schools, that language is important, most certainly, but the language of the streets, so to speak, slang, can be equally important because we use slang and informal language and cliches when we speak with one another. And obviously, when we're texting someone, we engage in very different language than when we are writing an academic paper. The idea is that you should be familiar with both, but you should know which is the most appropriate to use. And again, in an academic paper, an academic writing, which mimics the writing of business that you're expected to use. So this is how you can transfer those skills to the workplace. You avoid cliches and you avoid slang. And the semicolon is used sparingly. And I know the semicolon is a piece of punctuation that leads to great distress to students. Basically, a semicolon is used like a period. It separates two sentences. The distinction between the semicolon and the period is that the semicolon shows a very close relationship between those two sentences, rather than using a period, which is a complete stop. And you're supposed to use periods usually in between complete thoughts or complete sentences. And obviously, if one sentence is next to another, they will have some relationship to one another. But if there is a very close relationship and you wanted to emphasize that relationship, you would use a semicolon between those two sentences. So you could say something like, I love apples, period. They are delicious. And these are two separate statements. And you would use a period to separate the first sentence, I love apples, from the second sentence, they are delicious. But if you were to make the decision to use a semicolon, what you are saying is that there is a very close relationship between loving the apples and their taste. That this is a direct correlation. And of course, it's implied with the period, but it's even more clear with the semicolon. So that's it. Students will hear this and use semicolons all over the place, but the semicolon should be used very rarely for very special occasions, much like an exclamation point. If you put everything in an exclamation point, it sounds like you're shouting, so you need to use it sparingly. Same with the semicolon, use sparingly for special occasions. That doesn't mean to use each paragraph. That means perhaps to use once in a paper. But if it's used well, it can be a very impressive piece of punctuation because, again, many people tend to be intimidated by it. And all punctuation really does is it tells you what to do with your voice. Think about how it's easy to tell the intent of sit down, and sit down from the changes in my voice. But you wouldn't hear those changes necessarily in writing, so you could use a piece of punctuation to indicate sit down, which is the statement, or sit down, an exclamation point, which is the command, or sit down, which is the question mark. Comma is merely a pause, usually places where we normally pause in conversation, whether it be to emphasize a point or to get more air. I know the comma too can lead to a little bit of confusion among students. This is a great opportunity to look up Purdue OWL and to see the rules about using comma. But if you can train your ear when you're reading to listen to where commas are placed, or listen very carefully to other people where they're speaking and notice the slight pauses, I think you'll be able to just intuit the places where commas need to be. So, one thing that is very counterintuitive is the use of tense in papers. You should be using the present tense. And I know that goes against all common sense because all of the texts we're reading this semester were written in the past. And obviously you read them in the past. Even if you read them just a few days ago or even a few minutes ago, it was still in the past. But we talk about literature in the present as if it was unfolding now so that it could be timeless and universal. So it wasn't that Victor Frankenstein said to the creature. It's that Victor Frankenstein says to the creature. And if you have difficulty maintaining the present tense, well, keep that in mind in your editing phase to go through and look at all of your verbs. And if you've got them in the past tense, just move them into the present tense. So those are just a few techniques in terms of the writing piece. And now the last is the presentation piece and proofreading. Avoid mistakes in previous papers. Again, the idea is that the second paper is just an expansion on the skills that you learned in the first paper. If you have trouble concentrating when you proofread, you might want to try reading backwards. In other words, start with the last sentence on the last page of your paper and work your way up. Then you can concentrate on the actual sentences rather than the content, and then you can see your errors. Ideally, you take a break between writing a paper and then proofreading it so that you can view it with a fresh eye. The longer the better, but at the very least, you should take at least a couple of hours between the two, if not a couple of days or even a couple of weeks, though I don't think that timeline is realistic in a summer class. Your paper does need to have a title. The title needs to be original, so you can't call your title or your paper Persuasion, for instance, if you're writing about persuasion, because that's the name of the text that was chosen by the author, Persuasion. Now, that said, you can use the title within your own title. So if you wanted to talk about something like Anne Elliott's role in Persuasion, then certainly you can use the title Persuasion, but you have added additional content, Anne Elliott's role. So then that means that you've got an original title. And when we talk about independent texts that can stand on their own, not short stories or poems, but basically things like novels and dramas, we either italicize the titles or underline them. In terms of shorter works, which would be short stories, such as The Story of an Hour, or poetry, perhaps Emily Dickinson's poetry, those titles are put in quotation marks. And that allows you to know that that title has been published, because you're using a different kind of font or you are using a different kind of notation. Your own title should not be in quotation marks or underlined or italicized. You should have a title page, and that's just a separate piece of paper that lists your name, my name, the due date, the page, the paper number, the class. And again, this is something that would be considered to be conventional if you are submitting in a paper that is in hard copy. But again, if we wanted to keep to the formatting of what we would do electronically, we may as well just hand in the title page. I know sometimes students have difficulty with that because the title page is not numbered. The paper begins with its first page. So if you have difficulty with figuring out how to do the numbering, you could create as two separate documents, an electronic document with the title page and then an electronic document with the paper. But page one begins with the actual construction of the paper itself. Again, indicate the author and the work someplace in the first paragraph. And to give you an idea of the age of this handout, instructors prefer typewritten papers. Well, obviously, your paper has to be typed. Double-spaced, 1-inch margins. I have been accepting handwritten PDFs of journals, but you do have to have a typed version of the academic paper. And the paper's due on the date assigned at the beginning of class. Do not be absent that day. Don't be late. Penalties for late submissions. And proofread carefully. So that gives you an idea of some of the elements in that handout, which obviously is somewhat dated, but it still gives you an idea of some of the major conventions of writing a paper, which I've also indicated in our notes below. And not only have I indicated that what a first paragraph should do, state your thesis, and a body paragraph should do, state evidence. But I've also talked a little bit about quotation, as I had indicated that you are using the MLA association. And this means in-text parenthetical documentation, which means that when you are citing a quote, at the very ending of that quote, you use a set of parentheses. Whether the sentence is finished or not is irrelevant. And within those parentheses, what you indicate is the page number of that particular quote. Now, that said, I know that some of you might be working with electronic resources, and the MLA will talk about that if you're using with an electronic resource, how to go about documenting that. Basically, there's a works cited page at the ending of the paper, and what that does is that it lists all of the works that you've cited, that you have referred to in quotation format over the course of your paper. And if you're referring to more than one work, then what you need to do is to list all of those works by author's last name in alphabetical order, and list particular criteria such as the title or the place of publication or the date or the publisher. And there's slightly different formats for, let's say, a magazine article as opposed to a book, as opposed to a website. And again, this is something that you look up in your MLA manual, whether it's from your old textbook from an English class, or whether it's from the Purdue OWL website, or whether it's from the GCC library website for MLA. And you just follow the directions almost as if you were following directions in a cookbook, if you will. That said, I'm asking you to write a critical paper, not a research paper, which means that I'm not asking you to consult outside resources. That said, if you do want to consult outside resources, touch base with me. I'm not averse to writing a research paper, but a research paper can be more complex because not only do you have to incorporate what others have said about the text, but you still have to include your own unique position. So if you're writing a critical paper, you're really referencing only one text. So that said, you don't necessarily, at least for my purposes, need to include a works cited page. I'm assuming this is something that you've done in previous English classes. Though certainly if you submit in a works cited page, you want to make sure that you are formatting it correctly. But if you're just referring to the actual text itself, I'm perfectly fine with you omitting the works cited page and just using parenthetical documentation. In other words, when you are quoting, at the ending of the quote, you use parentheses, and within those parentheses, you put the information necessary within the parentheses to indicate where that quote came from. Even if you're using a different edition of, let's say, Frankenstein that I'm using, obviously your page numbers will be different, but I'm well enough familiar with the text to know whether or not you're giving an accurate quote or it's a quote that you happen to be creating. And that's the reason why we use parenthetical documentation, to determine that the individual is being ethical, that they aren't manipulating quotes, or that the individual isn't being sloppy. In other words, that they've made errors in the way that their quotes are. Because in theory, what the parenthetical documentation does is that it gives the reader enough information so they could find that quote on their own and thus verify the authenticity and the accuracy of that particular quote. That's really the only purpose for it. So, that said, there are some ways that you can change language within quotations. Obviously, we use an opening quote to begin a quotation to illustrate that the language that follows is not original to the writer. And we use a closing quote to illustrate when that's done. And you get to decide when to begin and end a quotation. So you can begin in mid-sentence or end in mid-sentence if you'd like. Within that quote, within your starting and your stopping point, it should be exactly what was written or said by somebody else, word for word, verbatim. But that said, there are some pieces of punctuation that allow you to change some of the content between the starting and the end point of your quote. The square bracket, for instance, not parentheses, square bracket, is used so that original language can be inserted within the quote. Not commentary about the quote or analysis. That's something you can do at the ending of the quote. But if you needed to clarify something immediately, it would be almost like interrupting a conversation. It would need to be very important. Oftentimes it happens with the use of pronouns, him or her or they, and based on the quote that you selected, it's unclear which character you're referencing. So immediately after the pronoun he, for instance, you might be able to write in square brackets, Walton. Walton is your language, not part of the original quote, but that is indicating that you've inserted in that name to clarify that quote. You can also use an ellipsis, which happens to be 3 periods, or 3 dots if you wanted to think of it that way. That indicates an omission, and that means you are leaving out between your starting and your end point of your quote information, whether it be a word or multiple words. You're doing that just because it's not relevant. You're not doing that because you want to change the meaning of the quote. That would be unethical. But if something is not relevant and you want to omit something, that's what you would do. So you also know those are cues for you when you are reading, that if you're reading a quote and you see a square bracket, that was inserted in to that quote. It's not part of the original quote. And if you see an ellipsis, the 3 periods or the 3 dots, then something was omitted from that quote. If you have a long quote, usually that means over 3 lines of text. then what you should do is use block quotation format, which means that you indent that quote so that it appears as a separate block in your paper. So it becomes very clear and easy for the reader to discern where the starting and end point is of that quote, because your quote is over 3 lines long, so it might be difficult to find that information. And if you are using a block quote, you don't need to use quotation marks. That's considered to be redundant, just the actual quote itself. Now, of course, there has to be a little wrinkle, and the little wrinkle is this, that if you're using a block quote, you have your ending punctuation first, and then the parentheses and the information within the parentheses. If you are incorporating a quote within the body of the text itself, you use your parentheses first and then the ending punctuation. So this is my quickie review of elements in terms of writing papers. Again, I hope it wasn't too long-winded for those of you who've done this before, and I hope it wasn't too hurried for those of you who might not be that familiar with it. But as I had indicated, there are resources online, and you can also contact me and I'll be happy to help you with that. I'm also happy to look at drafts as well before you actually hand in your first paper. And always keep in mind that you have the option of rewriting your first paper. I see it as a kind of run through. But at this point, I'd like you to think about the first paper, whether or not you think you might want to write about the story of an hour. Again, you'll want to do some very detailed reading because it's a short story. Or perhaps you want to write about Frankenstein. Or perhaps you want to write about persuasion, as we're in the midst of discussing it, as we see the world of the British landed gentry. And it's a world filled with leisure. In fact, they don't even know what to do with themselves. Going on a walk is a major event. Status and the concern for title, not just necessarily money. And as we're introduced to our characters, we'll see it's possible to have one and not necessarily the other. And ideally, one would have both. But times are changing here. And the landing gentry usually get their title and their money from property, which they've inherited and they might let out. We've got long classical sentences with very little action to sort of duplicate the lifestyle and the pace of the landed gentry, which is very long and not very eventful and very much concerned with appearances and social engagements. Marriage should have been done within or above one's social station. Marriage was more of a political than a romantic union that was used as a way to improve one's situation. And certainly one didn't want to marry below one's station, because then one would lose a certain level of, or one could lose a certain level of title or status, assuming one had title or status to begin with. We talked a little bit about the difference between a male and a female losing a mate, and that widowhood could oftentimes mean freedom for a female, as we saw with Mrs. Maller in the story of an hour, if there was economic security. And that was less likely for a male, who would oftentimes see marriage not as an economic vehicle, but as a way to get a homemaker and a caretaker. So there was a much higher remarriage rate amongst males than amongst females. And of course, Sir Walter Elliot is unmarried, and he would be considered to be a very fine catch because of his title and because people still believe he has money, even though he doesn't. So he's an eligible bachelor despite his age. But we're also introduced to lots of other eligible bachelors who've never been married or are also widowed. And we see all of the vying that is going on amongst all of the eligible females. Again, we're presented all with heterosexual relationships, because think about the time period, the 1800s. So in many ways, this text reads like a soap opera and trying to keep track of the romantic relationships that ensue, that oftentimes are not necessarily romantic, but they're relationships of convenience or relationships of position, which again, keeping a chart can be very useful. Think about the title, Persuasion, which means to gently influence. And not only is that going to be a major plot element, as we find out about Anne Elliot was persuaded not to marry, and we've learned the reasons for that and her regrets about some of those reasons. But the author as well is trying to gently influence or persuade us that the landed gentry live a rather empty lifestyle. And we see that through the eyes of Anne Elliot, who is rather critical of the world that she's in. Certainly not overtly critical. Again, she is keeping to the social conventions of her time. But we oftentimes are privy to Anne's thoughts, and we oftentimes are privy to Anne's observations. So that's a way that we can get insight into Anne, almost in the way that we got insight into Mrs. Mallard when we were alone with her in the room. Only Mrs. Mallard and ourselves, none of her family was privy to the information that we were privy to, nor her doctors, which is why they thought Joy That Kills was more of a positive rather than a negative. But we know better because we understand the epiphany that occurred when Mrs. Mallard or Louise was alone. So the next class, I wanted to talk about some of the specifics about persuasion. As I indicated, we are approximately a class or so behind, but we will catch up. And for today's attendance question, which will be due on Thursday the 16th at 9 a.m., again, if you need an extension, just let me know. Based on what you've read so far, would you want to be a member of the British landed gentry in Jane Austen's time? Why or why not? Again, the kind of question that doesn't necessarily have a right or wrong answer. I'm more interested in your thought process about that. This also gives you a bit of additional time, and I'm doing this deliberately, to finish up with persuasion if you haven't already done so. And hopefully you are also reading ahead for the rest of the semester. As I had indicated, probably the longest read of the semester is going to be Jane Eyre, but it will also be probably a faster read. Certainly there's more action that occurs than something like in Persuasion or even Frankenstein. So I think in that respect, the length of the text is balanced with the tension and the episodes of interest in the text itself. But we also have to talk about other authors as well, such as Emily Dickinson, so that will give us a little breather between two major novels, since this is very much a novel-based class. Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, as we're getting towards the ending of the semester, will be a very fast read, I believe. It was written by a female slave who was taught how to read and write, and we'll talk about how that was illegal at the time. But it is a very straightforward text. That said, it wasn't necessarily meant to be literary. It was meant to be educational, but I think there are literary elements within it, which we can discuss. But you'll see that the literary elements of trying to have us decipher meaning are very much removed when we get to Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And then our very last text is not a novel, but a novella. So longer than a short story, but not quite as long as a novel. And that will be The Awakening. So next class, I'll briefly touch again on our upcoming paper. We'll talk about persuasion, and then we'll transition over to the future readings of the semester. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.